We're getting ready to start our program. My name is Janethia Hutley Hayes. I'm going to be your moderator for the evening. My interest in education goes way, way, way back, but my latest foray into education was that for 4 years I was on the Los Angeles Unified School District's Board of Education. 2 years I spent as the president of the board. And before that, prior to that, I was for many, many, many years the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Martin Luther King Legacy Association. So it was a coupling of issues of social justice and access and equity that then intersected my feeling about education and how education looks and how that landscape looks. So what I'd like to do is let you understand that I think that we're all here for the same reason tonight. I think that everybody in this room cares deeply about the educational outcomes for children, for all children. And so that's what we want to have happen tonight. I realize that many times the reform conversation is a hard conversation to have, and sometimes the reform conversation becomes acrimonious, and sometimes it becomes hostile. But I honestly believe that there are other ways for us to talk to one another that are ultimately going to be good for children. And that's what I'm hoping will happen tonight, that we will have some very good questions, we will have some very good dialogue, and whether you go away having had your mind changed or whether you go away feeling the same way that you do, at least what I'm hoping is that we will have a dialogue and we will have civil discourse that allows us actually to do more listening to another point of view. And I say to myself, and I can only tell you what I say to myself, I always say to myself that I have to turn Janethia's music down, and that's what I call it, because everybody has a radio station, you know, their favorite station, and it plays your music, as it should. But if you're going to have civil discourse with somebody, you got to turn the speaker down. You don't have to change the station, but you have to turn your speaker down so that you can hear somebody else. So I want to now welcome and bring out our hosts and have them take their seats, and then I'm going to come and sit with them, and we're going to soldier on together. Our first co-host is George Parker. He has 3 decades of experience teaching high school and middle school math in low-performing schools in Washington, D.C. He is also the former head of the D.C. Teachers Union. George. Michelle Reed was a 3rd grade teacher, then she was chancellor of the Washington, D.C. school system when she and George found common ground. And that's hard to find, so you have to give both of them a lot of credit, I believe. She now runs Student First, a national advocacy organization with more than 2 million members. She left off of her bio, because I know her from that she also founded the New Teacher Project, where she was very instrumental in working with teachers and getting teachers into the public schools in a way that allowed her, for LAUSD, to create a program for us that was called Urban Fellows, which brought us a lot of really, really talented teachers. Dr. Stephen Perry is the founder of one of the nation's most successful magnet schools. It's based in Hartford, Connecticut. He's also a nationally renowned author, commentator, and television host of the education docudrama Save My Son. So all of these, the 3 of them, in a variety of ways, in my opinion, believe that teachers who are on the front lines in our schools should really be leading the discussion about education reform and how we transform our schools so that we get the children that we want to be ready for 21st century. They're going to elevate the conversation with you tonight. They want to hear your questions and concerns, and they want to have an honest dialogue about how all of us in the education community can work together on behalf of our children. And one of the other things that I want to say very quickly is that it takes a lot of courage when you're criticized to want to have an honest, open, transparent dialogue that moves away from personalities and moves itself back into policy, back into issues, and back into a broader conversation. So that's what we're going to try to do tonight. But I want you to know that they're not going to shrink from challenging questions. things that challenge their leadership styles, things that challenge their philosophy, things that challenge how they perceive and how they intend to lead in the communities and in the places where they actually work and live, as most of us. So I want to explain some ground rules. I believe in ground rules. First of all, I believe that one of the great things about having these kinds of discussions is that I believe in civil discourse. But I have to tell you, I believe in civil discourse. We can agree to disagree, but there's no reason for us to be disagreeable. There's no reason for us to, in fact, impact another person by being disagreeable. So we ask for you to be respectful. We do want to hear different opinions. We'd like very much if you could stay student-focused. And we'd like you to ask your questions in a timely manner so that we can get to as many as possible. Having been a moderator before, this is not something that the three of them asked for. But I'm going to ask each person that asks a question to be able to formulate their question, to think about their question, and ask it in 2 minutes. And when you get to 1 minute and 45, I'm going to tell you that you only have 15 seconds to go. And at 2 minutes, unapologetically, I am going to have your question forwarded to one of our 3 panelists. It's the only way that we're going to get to as many questions as we can. Can I ask everybody if they will agree to that? Yes. Because I think that's important. You know, I can't just stand here and impose something on you. But I'd like to make sure that for the bulk of you, that's going to be okay, because that's really how you do this kind of interactive conversation. So let's be respectful. 2 minutes per question, and let's get started. The way that this is going to work is many of you filled out cards while you were standing in line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull a card with a question that you submitted. And then I'm going to read your name, and I'm going to ask you to stand. And then one of, Josiah, where are you? There's Josiah. And one of these gentlemen will bring the microphone to you. And you will then be able to ask your question. And we're going to try to get through as many questions as we possibly can. So the bottom line is, let's get started. And for the record, they're not going to give the microphone to you. They're going to hold the microphone and you're going to ask. Is that smart of me or not? Okay, not their fault at all, but that's how we're going to do it. So we're going to get started. And we're going to break this up into 2 parts. The first part, we are going to actually have questions that are challenging. These are going to be questions where people are actually talking about people's personal philosophies, actually talking about what you like or what you dislike or what the criticism is going to be. So we're going to ask those questions straight up. And then the second portion of our program, we're going to go into policy questions. So our first speaker is Bruce Smith. Where is Bruce? Oh, there he is.
Check.
Okay. And your time, he's not going to give you the microphone. Promise you he's not. Okay, and your 2 minutes starts now.
Okay, mine was a very simple question. Michelle, I passed a bunch of union representatives as I came in here, and they have charges that accuse you of teacher bashing. I wanted to know how you would respond to them if they actually came inside.
Well, I'm actually sorry that more people that are outside didn't come inside, because that is the whole purpose of today, to talk about whether I am anti-teacher or anti-union or in trying to engage in teacher bashing. And so instead of staying outside, I really wish they would have come in. You know, this whole notion that I'm anti-teacher is a truly odd one to me, because I actually don't think that teachers are the problem. I think that teachers are the potential solution to the problems that we have in this country with public education. The research is very clear that of all of the in-school factors that exist, teacher quality is the one that impacts the most in terms of student achievement. That means that if we have high quality, highly effective teachers in every classroom, we can do a tremendous amount towards moving our schools to where they need to be. And we want to elevate the teaching profession. That means paying teachers a whole lot more when they're highly effective. It means giving them the tools and the resources that they need. But it also means recognizing when people are not effective in the classroom. And quite frankly, I believe that when we identify people who are not effective in the classroom, it is our obligation first to try to see if we can improve their practice and make them better. But if we can't do that in a timely manner, then they've got to leave the profession. And they have to leave the classroom, because we cannot afford to have our children languishing in classrooms where we're trying to see whether we can improve the teacher's practice, and meanwhile we are impacting and affecting children's futures. Now, if that is anti-teacher, I don't believe it is. I believe it's pro-kid, and I believe that it helps to elevate the entire teaching profession to say that not everybody can do it, that it is an incredibly difficult job, that it requires tremendous skill, and that just because you have a pulse and you pass the criminal check does not mean that you can be effective.
If I could, I'd just like to tag on that a little bit, because I'm sure a lot of that came from Michelle's
From
activities.
things that he used to say about me.
And so, but I want to say, I used to be one of those too. I was union president in DC when Michelle was there. And so we had some battles, but one of the things that when I started to working with Michelle, a lot of my union friends would say, how in the world, with all of the conflict that we saw you and Michelle have in DC, how in the world can you work with this woman? And I said to them, listen, that those things that Michelle and I were able to do for teachers that weren't sexy and weren't sensationalized, you didn't hear about. You heard about the real conflict when we got to deal with tenure. But you didn't hear about when Michelle came, and I had been union president for 3 years trying to get the superintendent, previous superintendent, just to give each teacher a computer to keep records on, and couldn't get it done. When Michelle came, I think sometimes we talked in July, and I said, I've been trying to get teachers, every teacher a computer to keep records. She said to me, they'll have them in October. In October, every teacher had a computer. That when I said that I'm trying to stop teachers from having to go in their pockets every time they come back to school to spend their money to get the classroom ready. That's not their responsibility. When we left, every teacher in DC now gets $200 at the start to get their rooms ready. We talked about professional development. We saw a model in New York, and I said, I want the system to help us fund teacher centers so teachers can get better educational training. We agreed they would fund 3. But those kind of teachers, when Michelle came and I was determined as a union president, when I went into office, DC teachers were the lowest paid in the area. And my commitment was, I want DC teachers to have some tough work to do, to be the highest. When Michelle left, DC teachers were and still are the highest paid teachers in the area.
So,
Those are the things no one knows about.
Dr. Perry?
A lot like that when
Yeah,
we were actually
I
back
got
that
it.
way.
Dr. Perry also would like to weigh in on this particular question.
One of the easiest things to say when somebody holds educators accountable is your anti-teacher. It's the quickest, lowest lying fruit. It doesn't even require much thought. But the fact is, when you believe in somebody, you want the most from them. And when you believe in your students, you just don't accept the kid who comes in and gives you half behind effort. You push him. That doesn't make you anti, that makes you pro. Right. And I don't believe that you can be taught to teach. I believe teaching is a calling. Yes. Either you can do it or you can't. Yes. And simply because you have a degree from somewhere, from somebody who says you can do it, you pass certain certifications, doesn't mean you can do it. That's right. And I see myself as a bit of a career coach. You work at my school, you don't do so well. I'm gonna coach you.
You out.
Because teaching is not for everybody, but school is compulsory. We have to make sure that everybody's who's in front of these children can teach. And to have high expectations of teachers, to me, is to say that teaching is the highest of all arts. Before everybody did something, they were taught. Before you became a preacher or a doctor, somebody taught you. Everything that you do, somebody taught you to do. And the most amazing things is that a teacher can impact you when you're 9, 6, 3 years old, and you remember that forever. Those of us who have the access to the ability to make decisions as to who stays in our buildings have to keep that in mind. The person who I think about all the time is Mr. Kinsel. Mr. Kinsel was my 4th grade teacher. Mr. Kinsel told me that I was going to be good because, see, after doing the 3rd grade a couple times, I enjoyed it so much. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Kinsel emailed me and told me he was proud of me. I sat in my office and wept. When a man can make an impact so powerful on your life that you not see him for almost 30 years in a simple email that I'm proud of you can still carry the same weight as it did when he stopped me and told me I was going to be good, that's what teachers do. If you can't do that, you can't work at our schools.
Okay. Our next speaker is Phil Keller.
Teacher accountability sounds wonderful. I mean, nobody wants to have a buffoon in front of a classroom. However, the major tool that we have or that's being advocated to evaluate whether teachers are performing or not is the performance of students on standardized tests. Now, one thing I always used to point out, I mean, I'm a teacher myself, is that you can accurately predict the API score, and the API score is pretty much based on standardized tests. California, it's a CST, based on the location, okay, of where the school is. Now, Diane Ravitch in particular, among some of your critics, has pointed out that social conditions that go along with poverty have a lot more to do with student performance on standardized tests than the teacher that's standing in front of or the methods that they're using in front of the classroom. I wonder how you might respond to that.
Easily. If we're going to say that poverty is the indicator of a child's capacity, then let's shut down all the schools and call it a wrap. And
Let's try to remember that we're being civil. We're having a civil discourse. Thank you. Go ahead.
I ain't who
Perry.
you think I am, partner.
Go ahead with your statement, though.
So it's important that we understand that we can't wait to cure poverty before we teach a child how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Nor is it necessary. Because we know that you can teach a child in poverty. That doesn't change just because we hope it's going to change. It changes because the only way out of poverty is the access through education. And what we need to understand is that our schools call for that. They expect children to come in not knowing. This is a country that says, bring us your tired, poor, huddled masses yearning to be free, not your middle class, 2-parent household kids who already knew how to do these things before they got in my school. So we know too much about too much to say that we have to wait for the social conditions to change, because there are so many schools right now that are overcoming poverty because they're created with the expectation that children are going to perform. They say that every single child's going to come here and going to get the best education we know to be. And that's the way we do it. And we know that some of us just so happen to have been among those poor kids whose fathers were in prison, who somehow made it to an Ivy League school somewhere along the way without changing their parents or their zip code.
I want to address something, because I think one of the misconceptions or bits of misinformation that exists out there is that reformers believe that poverty doesn't matter. And I actually don't believe that that's true. Poverty matters, when children are coming to school and haven't been fed, or the lights got turned off in their house and so they didn't, weren't able to do their homework, they don't have proper health care, does that make it harder for them to come to school every day and learn? Yes, it does. Nobody that I know anyways is denying the fact that it makes it more challenging and more difficult. I think what we are saying is it though doesn't make it impossible. It doesn't make it impossible. And for children who are in poverty, for us to say because you're poor, because you come from these challenging circumstances, we can't possibly expect for you to learn because look at all these, it just doesn't make any sense, because the bottom line is that for any kid, and if you look anywhere across history, in any society, what we know is that the best way to break the cycles of generational poverty is through education. It's not through social programs. Not that I'm against social programs. I think social programs should absolutely exist. But a social program that helps to feed a kid is not going to help get that kid out of poverty. It's going to fill their stomach for that night or for that week. But what's going to make sure that their kids are not in the same situation? Only education can do that.
Yeah. I just want to add one piece to that. And I have to admit, when I hear that, it really makes me angry. To hear someone say that where you come from is more important than the teacher standing before you, because if I believed in that, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I grew up dirt poor. My mother had a 3rd grade education, my father 5th. When I grew up in the segregated South, we had what they call welfare cheese. That's how poor we were. I'm so glad my teachers didn't look at me and feel they couldn't teach me because of how poor I was when I came into the classroom. I had teachers who, in spite of where I came from, they stood in front of me and they did what was necessary. Now, with that said, look, I taught 30 years in DC public schools, and I intentionally taught in what we call Southeast Washington, the poorest area of that city. And I can tell you, every child that came in my classroom, I don't care where they came from, I taught, and I taught well. And just recently, a lot of the kids that I taught, we went back to the anniversary of the Civil Rights March. And some of those kids they have achieved wonders. But I was intentionally in those areas, poor areas, to make sure that I was there as a teacher, giving those kids the kind of education that I got. Give them a chance to get out of poverty the way I got out of poverty, which was a good education. So I don't buy that where you come from and how poor the kids are, whether they're in crime area or not. Look, my brother killed a guy when he was 18 and had to go to jail. We had crime. We had drugs. But the teacher in that classroom made all the difference in my life, regardless of where I came from. And I believe that's true today. I do not buy the people who say where you come from.
Yeah.
It's more important than the teacher that's in that class.
Excuse me, pardon me.
The question was about teacher evaluation.
No, because there are people here that have filled out a card. And I just want to make sure that we keep on track and we make sure that everybody's voice gets heard. And I know you're passionate. I hear that in your voice, but if we can just keep with the flow of the evening. Afterwards, if you want to go online or if you want to have a conversation, that's fine, but we do need to move on. I want to ask one question for each of you, and then we're going to get into the policy issues. There's a lot of misconception probably in this room, probably in the country about reformers, and the fact that people believe that what you're trying to do is privatize education. That you're backed by billionaires, that you're backed by corporations, that you're backed with big money, and that really what you're doing is not trying to reform the public schools, but you are in some way trying to privatize, trying to break unions, trying to privatize education. And I think it's really important in this room that you give some kind of a response to that, because that's a big criticism, especially Michelle, that you've been getting lately. So can you All three of you, from your own perspectives, can you talk about that a little bit, and then we'll move on?
I think even among us, there's disagreement about what we believe school reform is. I don't suspect that we all agree on that. But components of it, I think we agree on. I'm pro-choice. I want a family to be able to select the school that works best for their children because I believe that children are different. My younger son is different than my older son. And they don't like the same things, and sometimes they don't even seem like they like each other. And I, as a middle-class parent, have that as an option. I can send them to any schools I want. But I don't believe my children are any different than the children with whom I work. And I don't believe that they should be given any other rights or privileges that the other children are not. And so for me, education reform is rooted in school choice, meaning that I'm for good home schools, good traditional schools, good charter schools, good magnet schools, good online schools, or any derivative thereof. Anything that a family believes will improve that child's probability of being successful. I believe in vouchers, much in the same way I believe in student financial aid, the way I believed in food stamps when I was using them growing up, and Section 8. I believe that those programs have provided access much in the same way that the GI Bill did to an entire nation that allowed people who otherwise would not have been able to participate in an academic experience because their means wouldn't provide for it. I believe in access. What I'm often amazed by is the children that those of us who work in urban settings, for a kid to be able to make it from their house to my school, they have to do some amazing things. And for them to be able to survive in some of these environments, there's something powerful about these little kids. I mean, some people don't like them, but I don't understand how you don't fall in love with little funky attitudes, all the time. I like it. I'm good with it. And for that child to have the capacity, but never have that capacity realized because she's in the wrong school. She wants to be in an art school, but she's in a traditional neighborhood school. Or he wants to be in a first responder school, but there's a waiting list that he can't get off of. For me, ed reform at its core is about choice. In much in the same way the civil rights movement was about choice. It wasn't about sitting at the front of the bus. It was about being able to sit where you want to sit. And so for me, education reform is that. As far as billionaires, I'm looking forward to meeting a billionaire if you know one. I'm not even, y'all laughing, that wasn't even a joke. If you know one, I'm really in the hunt.
We weren't offering you access. We were just saying that that's what you
otherwise, I got friends in low places, so no, I'm not funded by anybody. Trust me, that's my wife.
Okay. But you are funding your wife.
See, well, I think she's supporting each other.
A couple of things. I also am a proponent of choice, but I also believe very strongly that the traditional public school system can be much more effective than what we see now. And that's why I took the job as the chancellor in Washington, D.C., because I believed in the potential of school districts to be effective. And so, you know, when you look at it in DC, one of the things that I think we accomplished that we're most proud of is the fact that we stopped a 41-year decline in enrollment. And our last year there was the first year in 4 decades that we actually grew enrollment in the traditional public schools. So if what I was trying to do was privatize public education, then I did a bad job of it. I was a dismal failure at that. I think one of the reasons why, and Steve alluded to this, people use the whole privatization thing is because of my support for vouchers for low-income kids. Because they say, well, you're taking public dollars and you're putting it into a private institution, therefore you're about privatization. No, I'm about making sure that children can get a quality education. That's what I believe in. First and foremost, above any market, theories or anything like that, I believe that children should have access to a high-quality education. And so when I hear the voucher opponents and they're saying things like, well, we need to invest in the schools to make sure that they get better, and we need, you're taking money away from the schools that need it the most, et cetera. I actually used to believe all those things. But the bottom line is this: if you are willing to put your own child into a failing school, then you can be anti-voucher all you want. Then you are allowed to be anti-voucher and you're allowed to speak. But if you have your child tucked up in a Tony private school or a high-performing school somewhere, so your kid is getting a good education, then you cannot subjugate other people's children to a reality that you would never allow for your own. And that's my whole thing. I want school choice. I want my kids to be able to go to an excellent school. I am fortunate enough to do that. And I don't want to deny any other parent the same opportunities for their kids. To me, that's not about privatization, though.
Okay, let me start out by saying that I'm not an anti-union. Having been a union president, that's been in support of unions all my life, I'm not in that group. However, because I believe there's a need for unions. Listen, I can tell you, having worked in public schools, there are some principals who are nuts. I'm telling you, and that you need people's rights protected. Coming from the civil rights movement, unions played a great role in making sure I was paid fairly. So I'm not an anti-union person, but what I'm trying to do is to get my union colleagues to understand something that it took me a while to understand. And that is that the responsibility of unions can't be limited to protecting teachers. That we have to take on the responsibility of making sure that our children are getting educated. And as difficult as it, and that was a tough line for me to cross individually. So I know how difficult it is for union leaders today to cross. Because the issue of you collecting union dues to protect your teachers, what happens when the teacher is in conflict with the student? That when the best interest of the child is for that teacher to be out of the system, but you collecting the union dues, you have an obligation to protect the rights of the teacher. So it becomes an issue. And so I finally grew to the point of there has to be, a union has to be both. That I say to my teachers, and I said, look, my job is to protect your rights, not your wrongs. And so that the key here is, if you are teaching children, you are doing what you're supposed to do every day, then I will go and I will demonstrate in front of the superintendent's house or anyone else's house to keep you employed. But I am not going to, again, put a teacher in front of a child when I know that teacher is damaging children. And our unions have to take that same approach. It's that I'm going to support your rights to make sure you are treated fairly. But I'm not going to take you and put you in front of a poor child that I wouldn't let get near my own grandchild. Not going to do that. And so unions have to take on the responsibility for educating children as just as much as we have the responsibility of protecting teachers' jobs. In terms of the other part, I support public education, but I've grown to support charter schools, Steve, because I'm at the point now, if you're a good charter school, if you're a good private school, you're a good public school. Come on. Our children need you. And so at this point, I support good charters, don't want bad charters. I support good public schools, don't support bad public schools. And if it's a private school, I couldn't imagine, my mother had a third grade education, but I could guarantee you if someone came to her and said, Miss Parker, little George is going to the public school here, that's horrible. But we can give you some money to help you send him to a private school to get an education. My mother might not have a third grade education, but you'd have a hard time trying to convince her not to take that money and send me to a school where I can get an education. So I'll come around, Steve. Now, on the voucher piece.
We could disagree on that.
On the voucher piece, but the vouchers for only poor kids. I think kids who are locked into schools that just aren't doing it, that if they can get some money to get to a better school, fine. Because I come to the point of realizing I got vouchers when I went to college. It wasn't called a voucher, it was called a Pell Grant.
How about it?
That someone looked at me and said, "You are so poor. We know that your family can't afford to send you to college. So we're gonna give you some money that you don't have to pay back to help you get an education." And it was just happened not to be called a voucher back then. It was called a Pell Grant. So then when I started looking at it, is why should I say that has to be limited to poor children going to college?
Right, because they got to get there first.
So you first got to get there. So if a voucher can help a poor kid get an education, let's do it.
And to that, I'm comfortable with it beginning there. I'm also for tax credits. There are many families who decide that they want to have a homeschool opportunity, and they have to forfeit in some cases at least one income. I don't feel like they should be penalized because they've said that their child's education is so important that they're prepared to leave their career behind for it. I mean, that's a powerful statement when someone's saying that. It doesn't say anything against anyone else, but it says for them. So I'm for options is what it is. And just as a quick side note, I think people think that I run a charter school. I work for Hartford Public Schools. Trust me, I took the day off today and everything. So go ahead before y'all call us. He was in California then. They know. Trust me, they know. So I'm in a union. So, well, I don't know if it's good, but it is. But the point is that even from my perch, though I have certain options, I can see that children deserve options even if I don't necessarily agree with the option that they select.
Okay. That actually is the end of the portion of the program because there's just no more cards where anybody's asking any questions about trying to figure out their leadership styles or anything personal or criticisms. But we have the next speaker is kind of fish and fowl. So we're going to move into the policy portion of the program, but we have Emma Den Hartog, who has managed to be in both camps. Where is Emma? There you are.
So my question was about, thank you. I've had the privilege of working in Compton Unified for 11 years, and I am not a supporter of unions at all. And I really feel that what can you foresee that if the teachers union was eradicated, how many more, and tenure was eradicated, because I saw Waiting for Superman, and I just am in total awe of Miss Rhee, and I really feel like if we got rid of tenure, I know this is not popular, and we got rid of that pull, that children would have so many better opportunities in the classroom. And what do you foresee? That's my question. I feel like we're in this century where it needs to go. The tenure needs to go, in my opinion. The unions, I feel they're antiquated in the profession of teaching. I don't check in with a factory card, and I don't check out with a card. And we have 230 teachers that want their factory card checked every day, that I don't stay at a meeting until 3 o'clock. And I'm sick of it. And I've been there for 11 years, and I've met some amazing teachers and administrators, but I am... So that's my question.
Your
How
question
do you foresee...
is, if unions were eradicated, what would replace? And are you thinking about it in terms
I think
of
she said
wages,
union and
hours?
tenure.
And you-
I think she-
Yeah, I'm just saying, can you foresee a future? Because it's a radical, what I'm saying is radical and controversial, but I see a future without them. Do you individually see a
Okay.
future without them?
Okay. Michelle, let's start with you.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Perry, can we go with you? And then we'll give the union president the last.
So as it pertains to tenure, different people have different definitions of tenure, and some of them I'm okay with, and some of them I'm not. The bottom line, though, of what I've seen is that effectively the way that tenure operates in this country is that for the most part, if you have tenure, you have a job for life regardless of performance. And I do not think that it is possible to sustain a high-performing organization with those kinds of policies in place. So that's the bottom line. I feel like in education, we have to look at every policy through the lens of, is it good and right for kids? And the research is clear that there is no correlation between having tenure and being effective in the classroom. So I'd rather focus on then those things that ensure that kids are getting a good education. So for me, the whole tenure issue is really, it's more about performance, right? We have to make sure that we have the highest quality teachers in our classroom. And as I said before, if we have somebody who is not performing, they should not be able to have the privilege of teaching our kids. That's the bottom line.
Dr. Perry? Okay, hold it. No.
Process.
Excuse me. I need for everybody to turn their music down, and I need for you to turn yours down. I understand that you're passionate about this,
I'm passionate with people
but
alive.
I need for you to turn your music
right
down.
I
Okay, but turn your music down.
Yes, I
And
am.
let's just try to listen. Dr. Perry?
Alrighty, so I am, as you may have heard, pro-choice. If you want to be in a union, then you should be allowed to be in a union. Everyone should not have to be in a union. I find it un-American for anyone to garnish my wages to support things that I do not support. And so if the question is, do I think there should or shouldn't be, my point is, for me, I'm good. I can negotiate my own contracts. But if somebody doesn't feel like they can speak on their own behalf and they want to get together a group of people who can speak together, have at it. Go with God. The second part is around tenure. If tenure in the traditional public schools was anything close to what tenure is in college, then yes. But since it's just making it 36 months and a day, then no. If it was that you had to be published, that you had to go through a process with peer review in which you get, they determine whether or not you go from junior teacher to senior teacher, and from there you go on and you have to maintain your publishing and do these innovations. If that's tenure, then I'm for that. If staying alive is tenure, I ain't for that. I have to look in the eyes of every single one of my children. Every morning we greet the children as they come in. And I have to look them in the face and promise them that I'm going to give them the very best that I have. And it's not just me. It's got to be the entire team. Every single one of us must believe. And when you have a third grade teacher who is ineffective, not one of the 8-year-olds in that person's class can get the third grade back. Trust me, I tried. So they now have a gap in their learning that we attribute to poverty and parents and everything but the reason why. The ineffective educator before them. And so when that person is protected by process and due process and tenure, and it takes me 2 years of following this person around and taking 20-30% of my day to get one teacher who everybody in the building knows couldn't teach a fish to swim. And I have to have hundreds of children go through that classroom and I can do nothing to stop it. I do not support it, and I don't see how anyone who dare say that they are an educator and care just this much about children could support that either. And that's the application of it.
I tell you, you're really putting the former union president on the spot today.
I do what I can, brother. We don't usually sit in the same room without a judge between us.
Let me say this. I believe in unions. And let me tell you why. Look, in the democracy we have in this country, that unions are like people coming together The civil rights movement was about unions. There is power in numbers. So I believe you must maintain the right to unionize. Now, so I'm gonna always be a supporter of the right to unionize, and I believe teachers need to have the right to unionize. What I do believe, though, that needs to happen, that has not happened, teachers have not become active in their unions. Even as my experience as union president, the teachers who were ready for reform were the silent teachers. The teachers who wanted to hold on to the status quo were the vocal teachers. When you have a union meeting, guess who comes out? Now, as a union leader, the union leader who's looking at the next election, they're looking at the teachers who going, when they get that ballot, who's going to vote? Guess who votes? The teachers who want to hold on to the status quo are going to vote, and those teachers who are looking for ed reform, the younger teachers, guess what? They get that ballot, they put it on the table somewhere, and they never mail it in. So union presidents can count. And so they have a tendency, this is real. As a union president, after the election, right, we know every teacher. Now, we don't know how they voted, but we know how many and who voted. When those teachers who voted start coming to my meetings and talking to me, I know the next election they're going to send the ballot in. And when you're one of the reformers, and I know you didn't send the ballot in, you can talk. But I'm listening to the teachers who don't want tenure change, don't want seniority change, because when the next election, their ballot is coming in. So what has to happen is that those teachers who want their union changed, you got to get active. You got to get in there. You run for union president. It's a democracy. Union leaders now have become just political figures, just like congressional leaders and everybody else. We look for the next vote. If you're voting, I'm listening. If you ain't voting, you can talk, but I'm not listening. So but the union of teachers, it's important that you have a collective voice, but you have those who want reform have to become active, and you have to talk. You have to become active, because there is something to say about unity, about numbers. So I believe that unions should be there, but they got to change. Tenure. I want to define tenure, because it has been wrongly defined all over the country. And superintendents, listen, those of you who criticize unions, let me tell you something. When I hear a superintendent whine about a union contract, I say to that superintendent, I don't know a union president in this country who held a gun to a school board or a superintendent's head and made them sign a contract. So when you start criticizing, you got to criticize the people who sign off on these contracts that give unions power that they don't need. See, I believe unions should be about the business of protecting teachers' rights. But school districts have to say to unions, we're not going to let you run the school system. We're going to let you protect the teachers. But you don't run the system. But we've had too many superintendents. And look, as a union president, I wanted the power too. If I could control the board member, listen, this is real. If I could control the board member by paying for the election, before Michelle Reed, when you came to the negotiating table and you wanted to talk about seniority to me, you know what I did? I picked up the telephone that following night. I called my board members that we pretty much paid for the election, and I said, look, your boy's talking crazy. You need to give him a call. And guess what? It was off the table the next day. All right? So what I'm saying is you got to have superintendents who got guts enough to say, we know teachers need the rights protected, but we're not going to let unions run the school system. Now, on the tenure piece, look, tenure was designed to do one thing, and I support tenure. Tenure was designed to give due process to teachers. Due process meaning that once you're probationary, they get the right to let you go without a reason, right? We just don't want you. And in most school districts, you got at least 2 years to do that. Now, what tenure says is that after I've gone through my probationary period, I have a right, not to a job, All tenure is supposed to do is say, you have due process. Once you get tenure, it means you can only be terminated for 3 reasons. Number 1, disciplinary action. You do something so terrible that you need to be fired. That makes sense. Your performance is so bad, you need to be fired. And number 3, in case of a rift. Now, what has happened is that between unions and superintendents, some kind of way they've written contracts that tenure now means you got a job for 3 years, for 2 years, for 4 years, even with a bad evaluation. That was never the intent of tenure. Tenure was designed to give you due process, to say if Michelle Reed says, George Parker, I'm going to fire this teacher because he did something that was so bad that we want to fire for disciplinary action, George Parker says, okay, you got to prove it. Just like a criminal. They can't just tell you you committed a crime, they got to prove it. So teachers deserve that right. But then what we've allowed tenure to become in public schools, I've seen contracts where teachers can have 3 unsatisfactory evaluations before they're terminated. Tenure was not designed for that. That's when it goes too far.
To litigate a firing of a teacher in our district.
Wait,
Well,
I can't let you talk back and forth if I'm not gonna let you talk back and forth.
That's because, listen, I got you. So this is why I'm saying school districts got to take the map and piece. They got to take the gavel and say, no, no, no. We're not signing another contract where a teacher can have an unsatisfactory rating for 3 consecutive years. Steve, your child will be in the 3rd grade and still don't know anything.
Believe me, I know.
All right? So it's not all unions' faults. It's these school boards and school districts who also sign off on these contracts that say, okay, yes, we'll let George Parker get 3 unsatisfactory ratings in a row.
Which I would be the first to agree with. Let me be clear. That the unions by themselves are not doing this. It's cowardice politicians who don't push the envelope.
Right.
It's judges who get the opportunity to rule on some of these cases and won't. And most importantly, it's principals who walk around with their heads hung low, talking about, I can't fire nobody. They won't let me fire anybody. But that's just not true. You can't. However, after 2 years of back and forth, up and down, because, brother, I'll be honest with you, I had a man fall asleep as a teacher in a classroom, and I had to counsel him on what?
I'm with you on that one. So I think that's a good point, that what we've done is we've let union contracts go too far. In terms of whereas in some union contracts, the union is running the system pretty much. So I don't think you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say you got to get rid of unions. What has to happen is that we have to understand what unions are for. But the school districts cannot allow me as a union president to dictate to you the kind of education your children are getting. They have to help support it.
Right.
But that the union can't force me to put a bad teacher back in the classroom. That's what systems have to become very, very serious about. But you don't have to break up a teacher's right to unionize to get things done in order to achieve that.
And this is a caveat. Unions were actually formed to do 3 things: wages, hours, and working conditions. That's about a person's right. That's about a teacher's right. That's about keeping teachers from being at the mercy of nepotism, at the mercy of racist policies, sexism. And the fact of the matter is, it also helped a profession that was predominantly women rise to the level where they could get a livable wage. And as a former president of a school board, and having lost an election for that reason, trying to rein in contracts, what Steve is saying is true. That's my 3 minutes of breaking in and not being the moderator.
I'll just add one last thing. One of the things I think that does need to happen that could help that process is there needs to be a parent at the table. There needs to be a parent representative at each and every negotiation table, because by the time you get down to the Board of Education meeting and you're haranguing about something, it's too late.
Yes,
The contracts are written.
Yep.
It's really nothing,
Yep.
and you're not part of it. So
Yep.
80% of the money's been spent. The die has been cast. You can holler as much as you want, but that's not gonna change much. You need to be at the front end of the conversation when the chancellor and the president are in the room. You need to mosey on up and say, hey, don't I pay both of your salaries? Mind if I sit in on this one? And you need to have a representative throughout the entire process, and that's not what happens right now. That is not what happens.
public tax dollar. Is that what
And I
you're
just
doing?
want to say that any of you who are teachers out there now, and you're paying union dues, get involved. Get involved and help direct where your union is going. That when I hear teachers who are against their unions, it says to me, you're not getting involved. Make your union what you want it to be. Get involved.
Yeah.
Make the union take the kind of policies and support the kind of policies that you want. You wouldn't pay a lawyer. And union dues now in major cities are anywhere from $29 to $35 every pay period. You wouldn't pay a lawyer $35 every 2 weeks without getting that lawyer supporting what it is you want that lawyer to do, right? So why would you do that to a union? If you're paying dues, you become active in your union, make your union take the direction that the union needs to go to support children.
Okay. Our next speaker is Keith Dell'Aquila. Stand so they can see you. Yeah, thank you.
So building off of this idea, how do we get those people involved, whether they're non-participating unionized teachers or the vast number of teachers at charter schools in our state who are ununionized? How do we get their voice heard by decision makers?
So I travel around the country a lot and, give speeches, and inevitably, after every single speech I give, teachers will come up to me afterwards and say, I'm with you. I can't tell anybody I'm with you, but I'm with you. Keep doing what you're doing. And I'm like, what do you mean you can't tell anyone? And when I have conversations with lots of teachers, what they'll say is, I don't agree with everything but I think a lot of it is just sort of common sense. I know that the system is broken. I know that we need solutions. But a lot of teachers are afraid. They don't want to get targeted. They don't want to be seen as a troublemaker. They just want their kids to get a good education, and they feel like the best way to do that is just close their classroom door and do their thing. And I think that part of what we have to do is network, reform-minded teachers together to let them know that you're not alone. There's safety in numbers. There are other people who think the same way you do, and you do have to have a voice at the table, because right now there's a monolithic teacher voice in this country, and it basically is the teacher union leadership. And according to teacher union leadership, the most important things are seniority and tenure. When the vast majority of classroom teachers that I talk to, those are not their priorities. Those are not the things that they care most about, but you would never guess that from the conversation that's going on. So I think anything that we can do to try to bring reform-minded teachers together, to have real conversations, and to kind of give them strategies and ways that they can let their voices be heard, I think we've got to do more of that.
And one of the things that I've been doing is when I talk to reform-minded teachers, because one of the problems is they don't know how to deal within their union. Most teachers haven't read their union constitution or know the particular process of how to impact. And so I've been working with reform-minded teachers to talk about, here is how you initiate change within your union. And so I think doing more of that is how we'll get there, because there are a lot of reform-minded teachers. I would say probably there are more reform, in my union, I can tell you, there were more reform-minded teachers than non-reform-minded. When I had a union meeting, the naysayers came out. And boy, I'm telling you, they would give you their word. But the same contract that the naysayers in DC were against, when we put it out for secret ballots, 80% of the teachers voted for it. But that 80% They got to be able to come on and stop hiding. And so when I get a secret ballot, yeah, I'm with you, I want reform, but I'm afraid to come out loud and say it. They have to unite. That's why I say union, that those teachers got to unite even within their union to create the kind of change that is necessary. But I think people like yourself, of you are reform-minded, and other teachers, it's about coming together and as a unit, uniting to begin to change your union internally.
Well, really quick, because George gave us a number of really good suggestions. I think another one is use technology to communicate with other people who want what you want. Clearly, there's a certain level of anonymity in that. But being able to communicate effectively your ideas to a broad audience, whether it be to members of the union or teachers or whomever you feel is your target audience, and or connect to other groups through technology in the same way that are doing the same thing. Because I too have found a lot of the teachers who are reform-minded find themselves ostracized, or at least they think, because there's a bully teacher walking around making them feel like if you say something, I'm gonna say something to you. And they shout them down, and they make them feel like there's something wrong with them. And so these teachers stop going to the teacher's lounge altogether. They don't want any parts of that. They stay in their classroom, they stay to themselves. And they begin to feel isolated. It's just them and the kids, and they don't really have any friends at their work, and they begin to think maybe teaching's not for them because they think that everybody thinks that way. But I agree with what both Michelle and George have said. I find more reform-minded teachers than I find people who want to maintain the status quo, who want to take choice away from kids, who don't believe in strong evaluations. I find those people to be so rare that they gotta yell, because there are so few of them.
And let me tell you, I said union leaders and politicians, they count votes. You got a group, and in most union elections, usually about a third of the teachers vote. You got a group of teachers within your union who want the union to go in a certain direction, your union leader can count the votes, believe me. You'd be surprised how quickly
We did that.
the union leaders will shift when they see that the vote's out there because they want to be reelected.
The
That's
president
why I
of
say you got to participate to change your union.
the president of the principals union in Hartford is a very good friend, and we worked very hard to make sure she was the president, and she is the president. Things will change now.
It's like bashing the government, but being too busy to vote. I only remind it because only 23% of the people in Los Angeles came out for the last mayoral election. But there'll be a lot of people that'll be bashing the government. It's the same thing with unions. Our next speaker is Sean Hume. Oh, there she is.
My question is along the same lines. When we're talking about teacher accountability, we talk about standardized test scores. And my concern as a teacher is that those test scores for students are zero stakes situations or low stakes situations. It doesn't affect their grades, doesn't affect their placement in school. There's no reason for them to do well on those tests. And it seems like intrinsically motivating students when we ourselves come to work to collect a paycheck, as well as do all of the good that we do, seems to be problematic when that's the only way that a teacher is going to be evaluated and determined to be effective. So I guess I'd like to know what you think about that.
So let me first say this, again, another misconception. I don't know a policymaker out there, or an advocate, or a leader of a school district. I have not met a single person in this country who believes that teachers should be evaluated solely on the basis of test scores. I just haven't. So if you take me, someone like me, as the most extreme, you know, what we put in place in DC was that you would look through multiple lenses at a teacher's effectiveness. How the kids did in terms of their academic growth was part of it, but so was observations of classroom practice and contributions to school community, how the school, the staff as a team did. All of those things counted. And so I think that when people want to whip up this sort of fury and this anger around, you know, well, you want to evaluate people solely on the basis of test scores, that's actually a boogeyman that does not exist. So, and this is part of the reason why this conversation is important. Because there are a lot of teachers that I've met across the country who are like, it's just not fair for 100%. And I'm like, I agree. They're like, you do? And I said, yes. So let me give you a specific example. We put in place in DC, where 50% of the evaluation was based on student achievement gains, the AFT, right, the American Federation of Teachers, signed on board to a teacher evaluation system in Connecticut, actually, where 35% of the evaluation is based on student achievement gains. Okay, so is that what we're arguing about? The difference between 35% and 50%? Then let's have a conversation about that. Don't make this out to be something to scare the bejesus out of people that it's not. If you're saying 35 and I'm saying 50, then let's come to a reasonable, how do we determine whether 35 or not? I can't tell you, and I won't tell you that I know for certain that 50% is right. So then let's have a reasonable conversation. Let's pick 30 school districts across the country. Let's have 10 of them put in place 50%, and 10 of them put in place 35%, and 10 of them put in place 42.5%, and then let's just see over a 5-year period who does. And if the 35%, then I'm with it. Let's have a conversation like that instead of this fear-mongering, divisive, polarized conversation on these extremes where nobody actually is. So that's the whole thing. Somebody just said New York. New York does not evaluate teachers solely on the basis of test score. It does not happen. It doesn't exist. So this is part of the reason why conversations like this are important, and why I wish that the union leaders would have come, because if we can have those real conversations about the difference between the 15%, then we'll actually make some progress.
Can I also respond? So as someone who's still a principal and who lives and still dies, and our results just came out and some kids dropped, how is it possible for you to learn? I mean, what happened? To your point. How do you drop 23 points on a reading? So you can read less words now? WTF? So I get it. In addition to that, I just mentioned to you that we just got our results 2 weeks ago. They're absolutely useless. They do nothing for us. And for us, we're a year-round school. They're 8 weeks after the school year started. And almost 6 months after the tests were taken. So, lest we not think that because I believe in accountability, that I think that the way in which the current tests are administered is good. And then, yesterday in our morning roll call, because we can't have a staff meeting every day because the union says you can only have 2 a month, so you only have roll call. So, during our roll call yesterday, which is not a meeting. I kid my friends in the union. So, some of my colleagues said, hey man, I took that new test that's coming down. It's hard. I took the 3rd grade version and had to take a break. So again, I'm this high in this stuff. I'm not on high saying, just all. No, I get it. Now look, I'm there. I think that there need to be significant reforms to the way in which we administer the tests. For instance, I don't think you should have them all in one part of the year. I think they should be ongoing. I think it should be every 2 to 4 weeks. There should be a broken down version of the same thing so you get pieces of the information so you can understand how the children are doing. Because I think parents want to know, how's my kid doing? And we do know that there's greater variation between teachers in a school than there are between schools. And so one English teacher could be doing bang up work and the ones right next door, not so much. But if in the luck of the draw, you end up with the not so much, you get the A, but doesn't really mean anything. So we do have to have some standard measures. We do have to continue to have conversations about the administration of these standard measures. And then here's the last part. How do we, in a test culture, consistently get kids up for the tests? I don't know. And I say there are kids who lost 23 points on an exam that's only got 100 points. Whoa! Where'd you put them? And so we sat some of these kids down. Dude, what happened? They're like, I don't know. Did I fail? Kind of, yeah. So things that we must do to improve the administration of the examinations. But until such time, I don't know why the three-point line is where it is. I don't know why the 100 yards is 100 yards football field, but these are the rules right now. We can work. The problem that I have with those people who oppose, because that's what they just do, is they oppose virtually everything that sounds like reform or accountability, is they don't have an alternative. Offer up different tests. If you don't like these, write a new one. To Michelle's point, now we're talking about the difference between solutions as opposed to no solution or the solution you don't like. So if so many of the educators understand that these tests are administered in a way in which we can't use them, because we can't, right? Because I now have 3rd grade data and I have 10th grade data, but the 10th graders don't take another test in our state. So they're done. And the 9th graders, I don't have data because we only do it in the 10th grade. And the last test that they took was in the 8th grade, which is a different test than the test they're going to take in 10th grade, which is going to be a new test because the new test starts in 14. Do I sound like I've been dealing with this stuff for a little while? I want you to understand, as Michelle said, that I get it. God knows I get it. But I also understand that they do tell us something. These tests are not to be completely disregarded. If a kid got all 4s and 5s, you wouldn't think that that kid somehow hustled the system. You think that's a bright kid. And you wouldn't be shocked by the kids who got 1s and 2s. Now there's some kids who are in the 3 range, you think, damn man, what happened? Because you figure sometimes it's just a couple of questions up or down, right? And then you figure, you as a teacher, you're walking around and you're watching her put that thing, and you're like, I know that's wrong. And you know that's wrong. You want to say something right, but you don't want to lose your job. So, unless you move to Atlanta. So, don't invite me with a microphone. So,
Turn your music down on that one. Turn your music, turn it down.
we get it, is my point, but we can't completely eradicate the tests. We have to have something, and there are things that we can do. We work every day in our school to try and get the kids and understand, look, dude, this test matters. It gives us some indication, talking to the parents about it a lot, saying, this is telling us that your kid is in the 4th grade and reading at a 2nd grade level. Are you cool with that? Me either. Tell your child to take the test more seriously next time. And we do what we can, but again, this was not one of our better test years, And we're walking around sort of crying in our beer right now thinking, what happened? Trying to find trends, trying to find reasons, trying to uncover the data. It happens to all of us. It does.
Okay, now I want to try to get through at least 2 more questions. And we have exactly 10 minutes to do that. So I'm now going to ask the panelists to try and focus their remarks so that
We'll
you
do it
don't
lightning
each.
round style.
Okay, lightning round style, so that
answers.
you don't.
Yes. No.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure. So I want you guys to be a little more focused and a little sharper so that we can get at least these last couple of questions in. Our next person is Sergio Navarro. Oh, hi. He's coming.
My question was about data. A lot of schools, particularly charter schools in my experience, have a way of manipulating data in order to make their vision look more agreeable. My question is, what do you see the future for charters to be, particularly when there are quite a few that aren't necessarily upholding the vision that they say that they are going to uphold?
I'll really quickly say, I'm pro accountability, and I think what's interesting about many charters is that they have to re-up in most states. Was it 3 years here? 5, every 5 years. So the process by which they're being evaluated has to be rigorous, and they need to make sure that those schools are being evaluated to determine whether or not children are growing in their school.
I think we have a problem in the charter school sector in this country. The whole notion behind charter schools is you have increased authority and autonomy in exchange for increased accountability. And we've given the authority and the autonomy, and we don't have the accountability. And so you end up with a whole lot of charter schools that are doing really, really poorly. And I think that that is harmful to the entire movement, not to mention, obviously, to the kids. So we have to have charter school accountability. We have to aggressively close down poor performing charter schools. That's the bottom line.
Immediately.
And I think that in addition to that some of the resentment that public school folks have against charters is that very issue, that they don't feel charters are being held accountable in the same way that teachers and public schools are being held accountable. And so I think that you're right, that one of the focal points has to be that charter schools are good. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but we don't have the kind of accountability system in place for charters as we have for public schools, and we need to get there. Charters need to be held accountable in the same way that public schools are being held accountable.
Okay. Our next speaker is Larry Aubrey. Where's Larry? Oh, he's up here.
Thank you. I thought it was on education reform, not only on teacher, and there's been nothing but teacher discussion, but let me just say that I come from a different level. I was a school board member myself for 9 years in a local school district. But I'd like to panel any panelists or all panelists to address the need I see for more targeted resources for black students who, despite education reform, they remain at the bottom of the achievement levels. I'd like you to address that.
Well, I think one of the major reasons why so many of our African American children remain at the bottom is because they continue to attend some of the worst schools in the country. Starts there. It's very difficult to blame a parent who went to the same failed school that their kids went to. One of the reasons why I support school choice, including vouchers, is because right now a child needs a solution. I don't want them to have to wait 5 years for a proposed plan, or the new Now Wow kicks in, or the new superintendent comes in with her ideas on how she's going to make it happen. So for me, I believe that, and you forgive me but I believe black kids and Latinos in particular, those are the kids I typically work with, so that's the group that I'm most focused upon. We are in the fourth quarter. I mean, I have been to very few communities in the United States of America where black kids are doing well. Very few. I say very few as being polite, because it's, in some cases, none. You go to places like Memphis and see there's virtually 1/3 of the adults who are illiterate. It's got to stop. So we need choice. We need as much choice as possible, and right now. And then the last part I'll say is, it's on us as black parents. We have to put as much money in resources in our kids' ability to read as we do in their ability to be able to shoot a ball.
I want to say one thing in terms of the resources that I think is important. That resources alone, more money alone, is not going to solve the problem. And I say that from the perspective of having been the superintendent of one of the school districts that had the greatest per pupil expenditures in the country, and yet had some of the worst results. And of the $1 billion that we were spending in the city on public education, only $403 million of that was going into the classroom, into the schools. That means the majority of the money was being sucked up by this bloated, dysfunctional bureaucracy. If we would have put more money into that system without fixing the fundamentals of how it worked, it would have been good money after bad. So the idea that if we just put more money in, everything is going to get better, that's just not the case. You have to first do things like flip the percentages. The vast majority of the funds should be going into the classroom where it's going to impact student learning, not into having, thousands and thousands of central office employees, right? Those are the change. If you don't make those kinds of changes, then more money is not going to produce better results.
I also think your question hit on something very, very critical here, and why these kind of discussions are important, because a lot of the education change or reform debate has avoided addressing some of these issues, all right? When you talk about black students, especially black boys, it's very difficult to get public schools to engage into a conversation about why is it that African American boys are dropping out of school at an alarming rate? Why is it that we got more African American boys in prison than in college? It is hard to get public schools and public school boards and politicians to look at how do we address that issue in the public schools. The reality is, I've taught middle school all my life, and I can tell you, we need some special kind of programs to deal with African American boys in our schools. And from a public standpoint, it's hard to get the public to engage in that discussion, but it is needed. So I'm glad that what you need, though, is more school board members like yourself who got the guts to attack those kind of problems. One of the other issues that is not just black boys, it's this whole achievement gap, something I've never understood, right? Is that if you say black kids have an achievement gap, then why don't we have boards of education that's got the guts to say, well, wait a minute, if you're behind and you only going to school as long, the same length of time as the other kids, when are you gonna catch up? So then when are we gonna get boards of education to say, wait a minute, you 2 years behind, well, you need some year-round schooling to catch up, right? We got to have some politicians and some policymakers to have the guts to say the achievement gap, if everybody's running at the same level and you 2 years behind, you gotta get more education to catch up. And you may not be able to get it in 9 months. You may need to go to school 12 months. We need some folks to have real discussion about this and got the guts to talk about it and do it.
Okay, so we've come to the end of our evening's discussion, but I'd like to know if you will bear with me and allow me to indulge one of the members of our audience. I remember earlier I said that I wanted everybody to try to turn their music down so that we could hear the discussion. Dan Moran turned his music down. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to provide you with an opportunity, not for a soliloquy, because nobody else got one, but the same 2 minutes to ask a question, Dan, because I really want to thank you for observing the rules, for being a person who did turn their music down when you had something desperately, desperately that you wanted to say. Here's your opportunity, not a soliloquy, a question.
Okay. I don't have any children. The children that I teach are my children, and I extend that to all 600,000 in LAUSD. So and having taught for 13 years, I can say one thing. The interests of the union and the interests of the students are one and the same. And when people say, when Ms. Rhee, you said that tenure has no connection, the states, here's my question, I'll get to that. How do you explain the fact that the states with the strongest unions, the states with the strongest job protections, tenure, which is due process, not a job for life, have the highest academic achievement, while the states with no unions, with only associations, with no collective bargaining, are rock bottom? We're talking the Carolinas and all the Deep South. If there was a connection between unions and low achievement, it would be the opposite. All of these states in the Deep South with no unions who could do merit pay, fire at will, they should be at the top, and they are not. The states with the strongest unions and the strongest job protections. So I've been an individualist my whole life. I was a field goal kicker on the football team. I never wanted to get involved in a collective group until I walked into a union situation. And I realized the unions are
your 2 minutes.
So I'm going to go over that. How do you explain that the states with the highest job protections, the strongest unions, we're talking Massachusetts, New Jersey, etc., are at the top, but these other states with no collective bargaining, with just associations,
so there's your question.
See the achievement levels in California now?
California is a state that has very, very strong unions, very, very strong union protections, and very low achievement rating. So here's what I'm going to say. Wait a second. Sir, you had your chance. Sir, you had your opportunity. Let me just say this. I think it's important to note this. I do not think that unions are the reason why all of the problems exist. I think the problems lie in the laws and policies that have been put in place. In many of the states, the unions help to put these laws and policies in place. But to Georgia's point, there are administrations who are equally culpable in this fact. So you can't say all of the states that have the strongest union protections have the highest achievement levels. That is not true. There are some, sir, there are some, because if what you're saying is true, then California would be one of the highest performing states in the country. And it's not, wait a second, this is what I'm saying. That's why, this is why.
We're not gonna do it back and forth, for real, we're not gonna do it back and forth.
This is why to say that it's all based on whether a state is unionized or not, it's just it's a false argument. Not all of the blame for everything can be put on whether or not you have a strong union. It's just not the case. So you can't argue it. Somebody else on the other side can't argue it. It's factually incorrect to say that. So go ahead.
No going ahead. Dr. Perry, do you want to respond? Steve, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I was gonna, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. I want to say this, my union brother. I want to correct you on something. As a former union president, because I think that the discussion has to be real. As a former union president, let me tell you now, brother. The interest of the union and the interest of the children are not one and the same. All right. Now, I'm going to say that to you. I hope and I want to fight for the day that they are. But I tell you, being a former union president, and I still talk to most of the union presidents AFT right now, and I can tell you, there's a lot of growing within our union leadership that has to occur before we get to that day that you're talking about. And that is the day where the union interests and the interests of our children are one and the same. But I don't want us to deceive ourselves or anyone else into believing we are there today, because we're not.
Dr. Perry?
So there is no causal relationship between what's in a union contract and student performance. Because when we read most union contracts, they simply say what time you're supposed to come to work and what time you're supposed to leave. Generally speaking, what the process is to evaluate you and what it's not. Generally speaking, what the conditions are supposed to be in a school. And generally speaking, the class size. Now, the best thing that anyone goes to is class size. But there's enough research that shows that in fact it's the quality of the teacher over his class size that means the most. So even that is debunked. And if we were going to try and connect a dotted line to the coincidence of unions and some states' high performance, then we'd also have to look at the private schools in those states that have no unions and outperform all of them. And we can't simply say every single time somebody debunks one of our theories that there's poverty. That just can't be our ace. There's got to be something else. They don't speak English. We can't always stiff arm the truth when the truth doesn't fit into our box. And so I began this by saying that I'm not prepared to believe that a child, by virtue of their birth, is incapable of learning and can be written off by virtue of the fact that their parents don't have money. Similarly, I'm not prepared to accept any specious they're just specious connections to unions and performance. The fact is this: I actually do believe that unions are a very big reason why schools are failing, unlike my colleagues. And one of the reasons I say that is because they create such a backlog for even the most earnest administrators to either support or remove ineffective teachers. It's just the fact. Now, when we talk in grown folks' time, 2 years, 3 years, it's just 2 years, 3 years. Some of y'all can't remember last week. But to a child, 3 years is almost all of high school. So if we're talking about a bad math teacher, and you have that math teacher for 2 years of your high school, then there's a problem. I do believe that what is politely referred to as due process is fundamentally challenging what is the due needs of the children. When I have to take, because in Connecticut, in Hartford in particular, the probationary period is only 120 days. It's only 120 days. So you gotta do some foul stuff in 120 days to get fired. You gotta come in like, I ain't teach nobody nothing. You gotta go hard for real. So most people gotta have a good 120 in them. So I am acutely aware that the needs of the children bear no mention in the design of a union contract. There's not an ounce of research that can be pinned on a union contract that says if you do this like the union says, children will learn better. Not the length of the school day, not the time of the school year, not any part of it. In fact, just the opposite. So, research has shown us that longer school years and longer school days with more effective teachers, and those are all things, but none of that's in the union contract. So they don't want it like this, unless you're talking about colliding. They want it like this. And the fact remains that when you put students first, what you see is that you start making different decisions. The school week isn't just Monday to Friday. It's whatever it takes. The school week isn't from 7 to 3. It's as long as it takes. Because when you look at some of the most effective schools, whether they be charter or local, whether they be private or otherwise, you'll see, especially at the private schools and the charter schools, you'll see that the teachers have what they call a triple threat. They teach, coach, and advise. They build relationships with children that establish bonds and relevance. And that's what works. But that's not in the traditional school's contract. In fact, to do so would be very, very expensive.
Could I just do something here? I know your sign was taken. I want to hear what you got to say.
Was he asking me or he was just being polite? That's what you, president, does. I just have something to
She
say.
had a sign was saying something about students, listen to students, and I want to hear what you had to say.
No. No.
We knew that we weren't going to be able to get to all the questions tonight.
Right.
So what we, as the three of us, have committed to is that we are going to, online, answer every question that has been submitted. So that is our commitment to all of you. We knew before that we weren't going to be able to do that, and we,
On balance,
I do appreciate the fact that you want to make sure that we stay within the lines. I deeply appreciate that, and I mean that sincerely.
but on balance, the evening has really been what I would consider to be a success. We had 16 questions, and 8 of them got answered here, including Dan's question, and 8 of them we did not get to. So that's like a union meeting. Look around the room and see how many people are here. And then only, no, let me finish what I'm saying. You have a room full of people who I think are eminently concerned about what is happening in public education. There are at least 200 people in this room. I see some seats are vacant. But we only had 16 people who filled out cards to ask a question. One of the things that we are hoping will happen tonight, after this meeting that you're having, is if this can serve as a catalyst and a springboard for you as teachers, as students, to begin conversations in your home schools about the kinds of issues that were raised here tonight. That will be one action item that comes out of this that will move this conversation forward. I'm not asking teachers now to rush to union meetings because I know that your days are full, you have your own families, but if it doesn't do anything but spark a conversation in a teacher's lounge, if it doesn't do anything other than sparking a conversation with middle school and high school students who have a lot to say about what's happening to them, probably elementary school students too, in their own way, have a lot to say. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank all.
Are you a student? Could we hear her? I just think students sometimes get
I just love you to
We
pieces.
leave children out, and I think.
But I get to be the bad, I get to be the bad guy.
Okay, but you let them.
No.
Because that guy was loud, that doesn't mean that he should be the only one. Because he was the squeakiest wheel in the room and everything else sounded quiet.
Okay, all right, she got two. Oh, no.
I'm sorry, I'm not gonna take it and run. Hi everyone, my name is Hannah, I'm a student, and there's been a lot tonight, and I learned so much. I want to thank everyone for their thoughtful questions and the panelists for their answers. Just a few things though. I felt like this whole event was very much looking at these educational policy issues as a reformers versus teacher unions kind of issue. And as a student, standing here and watching this battle is really disheartening because it's a lot deeper than that, and these are everyday realities. And this is more than a reformers versus teachers unions battle. This is a social justice issue. And there was a lot of things brought up, going back to poverty. Reformers say that poverty isn't destiny, and that sounds great, and I believe in that, and that's awesome, but you know what? If you really care about students, you should say that poverty shouldn't be. Yes, we need to work on in-school factors, and simultaneously we need to work on out-of-school factors and caring about the whole child. Back to high-stakes testing. I don't know a single student, I'm sorry, I have lots of friends, and I have friends at other schools too. I don't know a single student who says that they learn something from a high-stakes test and the way that their schools are structured. They should be given the freedom to learn what they want to learn. Open curriculum, well-rounded, arts, music, athletics, humanities, teaching the whole child and nurturing that. What I don't understand, I used to stand by reformers, I will admit it, I did. But after seeing the facts and the data and everything and my own lived experiences, I cannot, I'm sorry, stand by what you preach if it has to do with high-stakes accountability. This school choice, which sounds great, choice is always, who can argue against that, school choice. But I don't agree with the fact that charter schools and how they push out certain students, and I've seen it happen, don't tell me it doesn't happen, because my own brother with special needs was rejected from a charter school.
You now have run out of time. Thank you very much, but you've run out of time. Now, one of the anticipated outcomes for tonight was actually to spark conversations. We're not sure whether people's minds were changed. Some people's maybe yes, some people's maybe no, but you need to understand that that wasn't the intent for these three. The intent was to start a conversation. And oh, by the way, I want to say to you, Dr. Perry, no teachers from California are going to Connecticut for 120 days. Don't any of you people try to leave the state of California to go to have shorter probationary periods. We need all the teachers we can get right here. But the goal of this night was to raise issues, hear different points of view, which I think that we did, and try to touch upon as many issues as we could by way of saying to you, you must hold yourself accountable now for going back and either starting a conversation, continuing a conversation, finding the courage to stand up in your own school community, not necessarily confronting your colleagues because you have to work as a team, but absolutely you're going to have to ask them and push them and hold them accountable for the beliefs that they hold as they will hold you accountable for the beliefs that you hold. Let me tell you the worst thing that can happen as we wrap tonight. As long as we decide whose children we cherish, as long as we decide whose children get to have a high-quality education and whose children don't, the burden that we are leaving for the haves is going to kill them in the end when there are more have-nots who cannot make a contribution to a democracy that needs a literate citizenry that can in fact participate in the democratic process and in the economic growth of the country The legacy that you're going to leave is one that will kill this country as we know it. So that's something that you need to go home and you need to think about that and you need to talk with your colleagues about that. We'd like to thank all of you for coming. We did hear you, we did listen. These 8 questions that were not asked will be answered. And make sure you go online if you have other questions. And once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Perry and Michelle Reed and Steve for taking the heat. Sitting up here is not easy when people have made a decision about who you are and what it is that you're peddling. That's not an easy thing to do. I know some of you think that this is glamorous and this is wonderful, but this is not an easy thing to do. So as you exit, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for observing the rules.